Hello and welcome to the Leaders in Supply Chain podcast. I am your host, Rado Palamariu, Managing Director of Elcott Global. Our mission is to connect the supply chain ecosystem globally by bringing forward the most interesting leaders in the industry. And it's my pleasure to have with us today Mike Zayonc, who is the founder of Plug and Play Supply Chain and Logistics Innovation Platform out of Sunnyvale, California. They have become the largest supply chain business accelerator in the world, and it basically they work with 30 corporate partners and a lot of startups to help them build their businesses. Some of their corporate clients and innovation supporters include Schneider Electric, Lufthansa, Prologis, Adidas, Walmart, DHL, FedEx, Shell, or DB Schenker. And Mike's innovation platform belongs to the wider network of Plug and Play, which of course spans across startups in a few other verticals, including fintech, insurtech, mobility, Internet of Things, FMCG, etc. They have about 6,000 startups and 280 official corporate partners, and they've created the ecosystems in many industries and many companies, and have raised over 7 billion in funding with successful exits including Dropbox, PayPal, or SoundHound. Mike, thanks for making the time, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks, Radu. Really appreciate taking some time to chat with you today.
So let's start maybe with the first question in terms of how did you end up at Plug and Play, and why specifically supply chain and starting the supply chain practice of Plug and Play?
Yeah, so I started at Plug and Play about around 5 years ago, where I was hired to work with different corporate partners in a variety of different industries. Some of the ones you mentioned, like mobility and IoT and insurance. And after 2.5 years of being there, I realized that there was definitely a need for innovation in the supply chain and logistics industry, and that there's a huge market opportunity to invest in startups scaling in this sector. And at the time, we saw a lot of startups like Flexport, for example, that presented at one of our first events before they raised their very large round of funding from SoftBank, where we saw a ton of kind of activity in the space. And I saw a lot of interest from corporate partners like Lufthansa Cargo and ExxonMobil around areas like where's my stuff, looking at visibility in the supply chain, looking at traceability, IoT tracking, but also trends like blockchain in the supply chain. So saw a ton of activity there, and just basically had the opportunity to start the supply chain and logistics program early on with a few corporate partners, and now it's grown into a very large program with a global presence. So we have offices primarily in Silicon Valley is our largest headquarter office, and then we also have our office here in Bentonville, Arkansas, where we support Walmart, Tyson Foods, JB Hunt, and Georgia Pacific. And then our office in Hamburg, Germany, where we support partners like Shell, DB Schenker, Chibo, and quite a few other European 3PLs and other corporate partners. So we've now opened up and are building our stronger presence in Shanghai and Singapore and Asia, and are really excited to kind of be a leading player in the global supply chain, connecting both corporations and startups together from all around the world.
And I know that your selection process is quite an interesting one, and also it's a mind-boggling one in terms of number of startups. That apply. So I was reading that you get on average about 2,000 startups that come to you guys to be part of the acceleration process, and anything from artificial intelligence, analytics, supply chain optimization, warehouse automation, blockchain, traceability, all of that. Now, when you have 2,000 startups, and for all the people listening to us, what are your criteria? I mean, how do you decide which of these make sense to get on the program and which not?
Yeah, so at Plug and Play, we're very corporate focused. So we like to see kind of work with our corporate partners to find out which technology areas are important to them. So whether it's around some of the areas we discussed, like machine learning or analytics, or just different ways to automate or optimize within the supply chain, or provide better visibility or tracking. Those are some of the big trends that we look at. And essentially what our job is to do is to make it easier for our corporate partners to filter these startups, to find startups that will solve immediate challenges for the corporate partners, and provide them quick wins, because it's very difficult for all these corporations to filter thousands of startups. So that's where we can come in and do a lot of that heavy lifting and meet all the startups. And at Plug and Play, we have a very large team. So we have, across all of our different verticals, we have about 600 people. 100 of those are just kind of what we call them ventures associates. So what they do is they analyze and they meet startups on a day-to-day basis and look at them for investment. But then they also look at making introductions to our corporate network of now over 300 major corporations from around the world. And essentially, yeah, we want to always analyze and figure out what the trends are and make the best connections we can possible. And when we're looking at these startups, one is we validate the companies that they solve a challenge for the corporate partners that we have. And then we evaluate their team. We see that if it's a strong founding team, that's where we'd want to invest our money into. And then also we look at things like how much traction they're getting in the market, and also like, is it a specific proprietary technology? So we kind of weigh all these things and see and test them out and see if they're going to get traction among the corporate partners that we have. And if they do, then we normally bring them into the program, and then a handful of the startups that get accepted into our program also get funding from us and our venture arm as well.
Understood. And basically, when you say and when you speak about, let's talk about team. So the team element, how would you define a strong founding team?
Yeah, so by a strong founding team, I mean, it's very difficult to build a startup. So that's the most important thing that we can really look at is, does this founding team show resilience? Are they able to find product market fit, pivot their business models if needed? Are they going to give up when things are tough? And ultimately, we really want to find teams that are passionate about their product, that will kind of do anything to make sure it's successful. And those are the ones that ultimately get the most funding. But there's a lot of things that we need to look at around the team. Is one, do they have a good technical background? Does the CTO stand above other technical founders and can actually build a strong technology? But then do they also, probably even nowadays more importantly, have a strong business background? Can they actually articulate their product to investors and customers, and grow their product from a business development perspective? So we want to see teams that can complement each other, that ultimately work cohesively. It's kind of like also building a sports team where you don't want to have everyone doing the same thing. You want to have people with synergy that can ultimately complement each other and really make sure that the team wins instead of just having a few individual strengths.
And tell us a little bit in terms of the collaboration with the corporates and also the whole model of the accelerator, right? And the whole model of plug and play. You know, how do you sustain it? Do you get a cut when you invest in the business? Do you also get obviously the corporates to contribute as for them to be members? I'm just curious also from the financial model perspective, how does that work? Who gives the funding? All those kind of facts as well.
Yeah, so we have a very developed corporate engagement model where we bring on a variety of different corporate partners. So generally there's economies of scale. By bringing on multiple corporations, it's more effective because they're able to ultimately engage with more startups from the corporate perspective. And then it's also more affordable for everyone involved. So we like to diversify the costs and just make it affordable for everyone and make sure there's buy-in from the corporate perspective. But then from the startup perspective, we ultimately have a very unique model where we do not charge the startups anything. We realized after years of doing this that startups are not the best customer, that it's not always easy to charge them financially to be in these programs. And then we also realized that it's most effective to not also take equity from any of the startups just for being accepted into our program. So oftentimes we get these startups that come into our program and they say things to us like, how did I get involved with this? This is too good to be true. Or this is like something that's really changed our business, because we're ultimately making these introductions to the largest companies in the world and finding the right people within these organizations to pilot and implement their solutions. So it can save them a lot of time. and which is kind of our ultimate goal. Is even though the startups don't pay us, we see them as our customers, because ultimately we want their time and we want them to be engaged, and we do have this large corporate network where we want to make sure that we're showing value to them. So it's kind of this win-win-win model. And then in addition to that, because we don't take equity, if a startup does want an investment and that they're at the right stage for us, which is generally seed or Series A level, then we can negotiate an investment case by case within the startup, because each of the startups have different requirements. They're all at different stages. Some of them have, they need a larger amount of funding. Some of them don't really want to have that much funding, but they might want us to contribute a little bit just to put our name on it. So, I mean, it's always a case by case thing that we can negotiate with each of the founders. And then we find that we make a lot of the best investments by doing that.
In terms of the most interesting startups that you're supporting at the moment, and it maybe is not a fair question, but because I don't necessarily want you to discriminate now that I think about it. But tell us a little bit maybe about certain examples. You know, maybe some examples of companies that you're supporting. What do they do? Some of the more, you know, let's say the ones that have gained the most traction, as you called it, just so that our listeners also get an idea.
Yeah, so there's many ways that you can define traction with the startups, whether it's raising funding or whether it's raising additional customers. So, I mean, we've had a lot of success in all these different areas, from the supply chain and logistics startups that we work with. And again, we're working end to end across the supply chain. So looking at technologies all the way from the mine to last mile deliveries at the consumer's doorstep and everywhere in between in the supply chain. So it's a very broad array of companies. I'll name just a couple that I think are specifically interesting that are getting a lot of traction right now. One of them is a company that was founded in Silicon Valley that we actually invested into along with Google's AI fund, which is called Gradient Ventures, and they're called Cogniac. So Cogniac, not like the drink, but there's an I in the middle. So essentially they provide this AI computer vision solution where you can essentially do these inspections and tag into any kind of camera system, and they can do a real-time inspection. They're able to train this AI to inspect for many different things. They're also doing kind of bill of ladings and trade documents at this point, as well as doing inspections for a lot of railroads. So a lot of the railroads have utilized them to inspect in real time whether the train's breaking down and there's a need for predictive maintenance. There's also been major rollouts across America with their technology where they can essentially scan people on trains that might be hiding. In Mexico, for example, there's a problem where people actually jump onto the trains or camouflage, people don't see them. So they would normally hire people to watch out for this, but their computer vision technology can actually inspect this even better than a human could, which ultimately saves cost for the different corporations as well as does the scanning for people more effectively. So that's a really interesting company that's gotten a very significant amount of traction through us and is really working with a lot of our corporate partners. As well, there's another company called Shoof Technologies, which we also invested into, that essentially their founding team built the Silver Spring Network company, which is the smart grid utility meter that you see on the side of every house. And what they're building is a new kind of wireless standard for connectivity. So they're able to make these inspections within ports, warehouses, manufacturing facilities, and able to detect these objects very accurately, have a 10-year battery life, and do this through a completely new kind of connectivity standard that they've developed. Their vision is to kind of build this solution so that it's as common as Wi-Fi is whenever you walk into a house or an office, for example. They want Shoof to be tagged into any kind of port or warehouse whenever you're tagged in to track your stuff. So those are two startups that I really like from a kind of attraction and growth perspective that we've engaged a lot over the last few years. But then another company that did really well from a venture capital perspective, at least a funding perspective, is a company called Rappi, which is a last mile logistics company from Bogota, Colombia. So they were initially founded under a different business model, but pivoted to making these last mile deliveries. And they have these red backpackers that kind of use bicycles to make last mile deliveries across Latin America. and they actually received a $1 billion worth of funding from SoftBank just in the last year. So from a venture capital perspective, that was very successful, and they're experiencing quite a lot of growth. And we're really proud to kind of co-invested in all those companies with top venture firms like Sequoia, but also companies like I mentioned, Kleiner Perkins and Google's AI fund, which is Gradient Ventures.
Rappi obviously is a big story for sure, and I might ask you for an introduction to get them on the podcast. I think it's it's obviously the biggest, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in South America.
Yeah, more than happy to introduce them.
Yeah,
so, we worked with the CEO for many years.
Super. I mean, that's quite a success story, and hopefully in many years to come they'll continue to grow. I wanted to ask from coming back a little bit to the corporates, and you mentioned that you're kind of doing the round of filtering. So you get the corporate needs and what they want to achieve, what they're trying to achieve or change about their business, and then you try to matchmake them with the right startups that may have the solution for that. How, maybe dwell a little bit more into that process. How does that happen? Are there specific areas where corporate partners are more interested in looking at when working with a startup as opposed to others? Because also when you get a startup, of course you're talking about a DB Schenker or a DHL or Walmart. It's a huge company. So to start implementing a solution, you need to start small. How does this whole process, how do they even decide? I guess I'm trying to formulate the question while I'm asking it, but how, from a corporate perspective, how do they decide which area do I want to work with a startup on?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and something we're very well positioned at Plug and Play is to really be at the forefront of what the industry trends are and what these corporations are actually asking for. We really like it when the corporations have this pull within the corporation that they need to solve this challenge. Because then it's easy for us to set up a session where we can recommend startups. And when we introduce these startups, it's more likely that the business units are going to pilot and actually move forward with these companies. So that's kind of, rather than pushing them too much around the startups, which we also do, because sometimes the corporations don't know what they don't know, and they trust us as kind of a leading innovation provider to say, okay, this is a startup that's getting a lot of traction. You might want to take a look at it. But generally, we really like it to kind of have these structured sessions where we're really solving challenges on behalf of the business units of the corporations. And I mean, we really look at a lot of different challenges. We see some big trends like visibility is a really big area. I know, for example, like there's a lot of startups that we've worked with that have gotten traction, like Project 44 or 4Kites or Ocean Insights for ocean tracking, or even Clear Metal, for example, are some just the startups that we've engaged with. But I mean, there's a lot of different startups around different areas where we might bring in around very specific sessions, and ultimately always thinking, how can we solve this corporation's challenge? And yeah, I mean, there's quite a few areas, like whether it's how to automate within a warehouse or how to really track kind of stuff, whether it's in a truck or a warehouse or a port, for example. And ultimately, we really want to just know kind of which startups will solve these challenges so we can best recommend them and keep the good faith with our corporate partners.
I'm just wondering also, did you ever get in the position where a corporate client bought a startup by themselves?
Yeah, there's actually been a few acquisitions. Sometimes we get asked by a corporate partner, like less than 1% of the time, that, hey, we want to buy this technology. Obviously, though, it's a long process. Where we really focus on is 70% of the time, we want to introduce pilots and potential business development engagements or POCs to the corporate partner so they can just test and potentially further implement the technology. And then I would say a minor percent of the time, some of the corporates also want to invest into the startups, which is something we can always discuss with them as well. But generally, the first step before acquiring or doing an investment or a corporate investment into the startups is really to just pilot and test the technology and validate it. That's where a lot of our more successful partners have done it. I know that's kind of the mindset of like Prologis Ventures, which is an active partner of ours, the largest owner of industrial warehouses in the world. And they are a very active investor from a corporate perspective in the startups, but generally they like to get things started with a pilot.
How about in terms of making the difference, and what tells you whether a startup is going to make it versus some startups that may not make it? And I mean, at the end of the day, in reality, no matter the way and the acceleration and everything, it's still a numbers game, right? So it's still most of the
Yeah.
startups do fail. So in this journey, and you've seen a lot of startups and you work with a lot of startups, what do you see makes the difference between the ones that will make it ultimately and the ones that will fail along the way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's really hard to say. There's a lot of factors, like everything needs to line up for a startup to really be one of the home runs that we're looking for as a venture capital investor. But we do need to kind of make sure that the team is fully engaged, that they're really passionate about their product, that they won't give up, and that ultimately, I would say it takes 7 to 10 years for us a lot of times as an early stage investor to see a return from these investments, because we only make money as an investor when they get acquired or when they IPO, which is a super long-term thing. So I think we'll see a lot more kind of the success stories down the road, but obviously we want to make sure that kind of all the metrics add up, and sometimes we're surprised. I mean, I think being opportunistic from the startup perspective is really important. Being flexible and willing to pivot and find product market fit is something that we see in a lot of startups, because they maybe not have the perfect product in the beginning, but if they can validate that and work very closely with their customers, those are generally the startups that we find are the most successful down the long term.
And in terms of let me flip the question. In terms of mistakes you've made, um, what are some of the maybe you, or I mean it does happen, right? You also select sometimes the startups that don't work out. So maybe there's a pattern there that you can share also for all the founders listening to us, or for all the corporate innovation people listening to us, that they could watch out for.
Yeah, I would say that there's definitely mistakes that we make. I'd say a lot of startups, they don't kind of give us the returns that we would want, is to return our capital from making an investment. It's very hard to kind of say what went wrong. I mean, over time, but I would say just kind of looking for those general trends around having a very passionate team that we really believe could address a very large market and ultimately potentially, hopefully, even disrupt or have an enormous impact on the industry. That we're really looking for these kind of big vision type of entrepreneurs. But generally, obviously, some of them are going to fail and not be successful. But it's hard to point fingers. We do like to work with these serial entrepreneurs as well, that they don't give up too easily, that they don't have a plan B. They ultimately, they're going to make this startup succeed. Otherwise, they have no other choice. They don't even think about kind of the other options. And those are the kind of founders that we really want to work with.
Burn your bridges. Yeah, that's a good strategy to make sure that that the person carries on no matter what. So could not agree more. What are some of the main principles that you want to instill in your startup's culture? So culture is a big, it's an intangible, but it's a big thing to make or break a company. So are there certain principles that you want to make sure they have in terms of the way they operate their businesses? You've mentioned just now
Yeah.
that, don't have a plan B and make sure you work until you make it. But are there some other principles that you want to see in your startups in culture?
Yeah, definitely. We like to have things like integrity being part of the startup's culture. For example, if they're telling us they have these numbers, we expect them not to be lying, and for them to be telling the truth, and for them to be respectful of people's time, and just kind of have that strong business knowledge of obviously prioritizing what meetings are the most important, but trying to stay true to their word and following through on what they promise. That's something that's very, very important for us. We also like to have, as I mentioned, very hardworking teams. So building a startup is not easy. It requires a lot more effort than a traditional job or even working in a large corporation. So we want these entrepreneurs to be very hardworking and put in extra effort and to make sacrifices to do everything they can to make sure the business is successful. We also like to have as I mentioned, passionate teams. So teams that really they believe in this. They believe that this will change the world. They believe that this will be a very successful company. And ultimately, once they have this passion, I think you can kind of see it when you meet the founding teams, and it just gives them a bit more of an engine. So when times get hard, that they're able to have that underlying passion to make sure that they keep going. And then, yeah, I'd say, just a collaborative team environment is really important, that they work well with others, that they have good interpersonal skills, that people want to work with them. So they're not too cocky, but they still have some sort of humility where people want to do business with them and ultimately enjoy kind of their experience working with the company. And then, I mean, there's a lot of things that we think will make the company successful, but then again, we're sometimes wrong as well. Is that sometimes a founder doesn't have one of these things and they still are successful. But I would say more often than not, those are some of the things that we look for when we're putting money and investing into these startups.
Mm. And look, I mean, Mike, if you had found the silver bullet that works for all startups, I think you would be a multi-billionaire. So they probably. I mean, I think a lot of people have been looking for that silver bullet that works for all, but luckily, I think, or fortunately, there's no such thing, right? So sometimes it's just a combination, and sometimes, like you rightfully said, you might not need or you might not have all the different ingredients, but it still works out somehow. So it's a good point. Moving on to the talent recruitment, attracting people side, right? So once a startup grows, they begin to have more and more traction. They have more and more success. They need to start recruiting and hiring, and especially the first hires, the first 5-10 people to add to the business can be or are usually critical. Are there certain patterns, advice, or principles that you think are critical when it comes to hiring the first members of the teams?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we really believe in like that hire slow and fire fast mentality. So if people aren't meeting their objectives, that it's best to not have them on the team, and then to really be careful about who you bring on to the founding team and how you kind of incentivize the team. So those are really important things. And especially when we look at startups, like how is the equity distributed in the company, the cap table can tell you a lot about kind of the foundation of the company. So I would say having kind of a culture that kind of is resonates with each other, that people ultimately kind of believe in the vision of the whole culture. I think that's really important. And then ultimately, it's good to also have diverse teams. So as I mentioned, teams that complement each other, they have different skill sets, and they ultimately have the same vision at the end. So they're working towards the same goal.
In terms of training and sort of more formal type of skills that you may want your founders to acquire, and sometimes it can be financial skills or financial acumen, I don't know, it can be anything, but are there certain core business or management type of trainings or courses that you want them to go through to make sure they have the fundamentals in place in terms of running a business?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think overall, the biggest thing is to have an open mind as an entrepreneur. Is that a lot of times you have to have flexibility, that it's a very agile environment, that you have to be able to kind of learn on the fly and just be proactive about things. So if you do something that you think could improve the business, just to go out and do it. And it's kind of better, we believe, to have this kind of act now, apologize later type mentality, where as a startup, you have to make moves and even take some risks, but it's better to move quickly than not move at all. So that's the game. I would say overall of being a startup is just really be opportunistic. Like one of the quotes our CEO Saeed always says is that his father apparently used to always say to him was, when opportunity knocks, open the door.
That's a good one. It's a good one, and it's not always easy to do, even if it sounds very common sense. Regarding and you mentioned Project 44, and we actually had Jet, their CEO, on the podcast, and some of the most successful startups you've had, and they've I mean, specifically just for Project 44, you mentioned a few other names here, Metal and Four Kites and all of that, and they've managed to attract a lot of interest, a lot of clients. Obviously, the visibility piece is something that's really big for a lot of the corporates at the moment. I wanted to ask you also from a process perspective, from one of these big clients, like you have a Walmart. So let's say they pilot the startup X. There's no name, the startup, right? They pilot the solution. It works. They have some good results. What's the typical implementation process and adoption process in a big corporate? How do they typically go about trying to make that as almost as a organizational wide type of initiative that gets implemented across the big organization?
Yeah, so generally, like the way we work with these companies is we try and bring in the relevant champions from. They can bring in business units of the companies that would actually work with that specific solution or technology area, and then normally the corporation would go through the process of signing some sort of NDA or legal agreement, which for some corporations can be a very tedious process, as a lot of corporations sometimes have these 50-page, for example, MSA agreements, which they would put on a startup, which doesn't work because the startup doesn't have the legal resources to actually go through all the legal paperwork. But yeah, I say generally we like to make sure that they have a short kind of MSA or legal agreement in place with the startups. It's very startup friendly. And after that process has gone through, we really encourage there to be pilots between the corporations and the startups. And if it works, the pilot works, then they should scale it up more and ultimately roll it out across a larger area of the company. But if it doesn't work, then to just end it and move on quickly. So we really encourage this kind of test and pivot type of methodology, and ultimately cutting it out if it doesn't work at all.
Final question from me. What would be the best piece of advice that you would give a founder, co-founder, or founding team of a startup in terms of making their idea successful? Just one.
My advice is probably the most important thing for a startup, assuming they're already passionate and really care about their product and working hard on it, is to be opportunistic, is to just keep an open mind. And for example, really always listen to your customers. If you're finding a lot of traction in a market segment that you didn't think was a fit initially, just be open to kind of pivoting your business and ultimately scaling it and focusing on it where you're actually driving revenue. Because as a business that's hoping to scale, it's really important to generate that initial traction, and things like revenue or kind of number of users or whatever the traction metrics are. Those things are really important, and to be able to demonstrate that to VCs and investors, that's something that will really help them from a metrics perspective when they're trying to grow.
Mm-hmm. Mike, thank you so much. It's been extremely insightful. I'm sure a lot of the people listening that want to go into the startup world or are already there, or as well as people from the corporate side. And I know there's a lot of them in this time of change that are very much interested in innovation and making it happen and making this transformation happen. Found a lot of interesting examples in your sharing, and good luck at Plug and Play. Good luck to continue to grow supply chain startups and help overall the ecosystem innovate. And it's been a pleasure to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Radu. Really appreciate the time and getting some exposure for our program, and for any corporations, startups, or anyone kind of in the innovation ecosystem that Plug and Play, we're an open innovation ecosystem, kind of like you, where we want to work with a broad array of startups and just kind of know what startups are in the market. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or my email, which is mike@pnptc.com.
Super. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you liked what you heard, be sure to go to www.elcotglobal.com and click the podcast button for all the show notes of the interview. Also, subscribe to our mailing list to get our latest updates first. If you're listening through a streaming platform like iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher, we would appreciate a kind review. 5-star works best to keep us going and our production team happy. And of course, share it with your friends. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so do feel free to follow me. And if you have any suggestions on what to do and who to invite next, don't hesitate to drop me me a note. And if you're looking to hire top executives in supply chain or transform your business, of course, contact us as well to find out how we can help.